afternoon. Excellencies, distinguished guests, on behalf of the representation of the European Commission in Latvia, welcome to the European House in Riga. Welcome also to our virtual audience, as this event is being broadcast on the internet. We are here to debate the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is currently being negotiated between the EU and the United States. The organizers have assembled a panel of experts to debate this topic, each of whom I will be introducing shortly. My name is Ivar Slukamerks. I've been invited to moderate this discussion in my capacity as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Latvia. So thank you as well for the invitation. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, or TTIP as it's often called, as proposed, is a bold effort to reignite growth in the EU and the US to create new jobs, promote competitiveness, to increase trade and investment across the Atlantic. Now we know the US and EU are just emerging, if barely, from a severe downturn in the wake of the global financial crisis and various debt crises. Public budgets are severely stretched, so increased trade and investment is a necessary component of recovery. But multilateral negotiations to liberalize global trade have stalled. We're also undergoing a period of uncertainty where the once dominant transatlantic, say West, is being challenged by new economic players. There may be, which foretell some possible shifts in the balance of power, possibly away from the transatlantic to other regions. So the US and EU have come to the conclusion that a bilateral negotiation on liberalizing trade and investment across the Atlantic is the best initial step forward to promote growth. Now, notably, the US and EU economic relationship is by far already the largest in the world. In fact, our countries of the two, of EU and US, account for nearly 40% of global production. So given the immense size of this relationship, even small improvements in trade and investment would bring meaningful benefits to the economies and the populations. Now, without going into a long history on the negotiations, they began in Washington in early July. The next round is due to be held in Brussels in 2 weeks. A third round of negotiations is due in December. There's a very aggressive time schedule. The parties are aiming to complete negotiations by the end of 2014. Now, it will not be very simple, as this is not merely a question of reducing tariffs. It's the elimination of non-tariff barriers, which will be the most difficult to agree on. For example, differing health, sanitary, and safety regulations, incompatible regulatory approval procedures, technical barriers, various product standards, subsidies, customs procedures, and so on, different competition and IP protection regimes. Abroad, entrenched lobbies and nationalist protections will come to the fore. A broad spectrum of sectors will be affected and will require compromise on difficult issues from biotechnology, GMOs, data protection, information security, nanotechnology, copyright law, you name it. There's a broad gamut of issues that will come up. The elimination of or the lowering of relatively already low tariff rates will be the easiest part. These non-tariff barriers will be the difficult part. To date, there has been relatively little public discussion of TTIP in Latvia, so it is hoped that this discussion will change that. Now, we have a very distinguished panel of 4 speakers. I will introduce each of them and then give each of them the floor, and then that will be followed by questions and answers. First off, on the end, Mr. Peter Balash. He's the Deputy Director General of the Directorate General for Trade at the European Commission. He joined the EC in November 2005 and has held his post in DG Trade since then. Earlier, he was Hungary's ambassador to the WTO. He has a long career in Hungary's Ministries of Economy, Foreign Affairs, and International Economic Relations. He was also deputy head of the GATT delegation for Hungary in Geneva. He holds a doctor's degree in economics from Budapest University of Economic Sciences. Next, representing the United States, Tara Arith, Director of the Office of Nordic and Baltic Affairs at the U.S. State Department. Most recently, she was economic counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul Afghanistan. Previously, she was the acting director of the Office of European Union and Regional Affairs. Other assignments include economic counselor in Brasilia, director for investment, agriculture, and sanctions at the National Security Staff, tours in Washington, Brussels, Paris, and Lubumbashi, Congo. She holds a BA from Williams College in economics and in French, and an MS from the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Next, our representative from Latvia, Ms. Zaigaliepina. She's Deputy State Secretary at the Ministry of Economics in Latvia. She's been in her position at the Foreign Economic Relations Department. Not working? You can hear me? Since 2002. Ms. Liepina's department is the main coordinating body for EU issues in the Ministry of Economics. And earlier she worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She has a degree in International Economic Relations from the University of Latvia. Finally, our guest from the United Kingdom, Mr. David Hennick. He is Assistant Director of TTIP in the UK government's Department for Business Innovation and Skills. He moved to this role only in June, having previously worked on international business policy, including focusing on China, the OECD, and the UK's G8 presidency. A graduate of Oxford University, David spent 14 years in the private sector as a management consultant before joining the UK government in 2009. So I've spoken enough. Let's give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Wallace.
Thanks very much. In your introduction, you have already referred to the extraordinary challenges of this agreement. So let me just go through about the basic features of these negotiations, which really have been launched just a couple of months ago. First of all, what is the economic logic of these negotiations? It's not just that, as you mentioned, 40% of the world GDP is represented by the EU and the US respectively, but also a very large percentage of world trade, in spite of the fact that developed countries' share is gradually being reduced, but still the EU and US and the transatlantic trade are the major components of world trade, representing almost 800 billion trade in goods and services. It's about two-thirds of it in goods and one-third of it in services. I would mention that this trade is in the surplus from the EU's point of view, so there is also an interest for both sides to increase the trade. When it comes to investments, the bilateral investment stocks are in the range of 2.5 trillion euros. It's more or less evenly balanced between our investment inflows and outflows. What are the objectives based on these economic facts? First of all, both sides would like to have a broad and comprehensive agreement, which is a modern agreement and which covers all elements which are important for international economic relations. We would like this agreement not just to set a standard for the two economies, but also set a standard for the world, a kind of a golden standard. And to be frank, there is also the expectation that these negotiations could give a push to the stalled multilateral negotiations in Geneva. As you are aware, the so-called Doha round of negotiation is now couldn't make progress over 12 years, and it would be high time to complete it. We do hope that the economic impact of this agreement will also help to push forward the multilateral liberalization over the world. How do we want to achieve it? It should be, there was a lot of discussion, to be frank, before this agreement has been launched, because the negotiations have been launched and the respective mandates were provided, whether should be do it piecemeal. There were some ideas that focus on tariffs first, that this is perhaps easier, deal with the regulatory issues later, focus on goods and services later. But finally, based on extensive preparatory work, it has been found that the only chance for success, considering the diversity of interest, is to go for a single but broad agreement, which of course would let the possibilities to be developed later, but at least, even if it's first go, to cover a broad range of subjects. It's a maximalist agreement in the sense that we want to go for a very broad liberalization, in principle covering all goods and all types of services, so any kind of exclusions would be limited to a minimum. And really, the major challenge will be behind the border barriers, as tariffs do not play anymore, especially when it comes to trade in industrial products, a major role in the protection. It is more behind the barriers, what you could call non-tariff obstacles, regulations, which are the major means of continued protection for domestic producers. The expectations are to have fast negotiations, really, to try to complete it in something like 1.5 years. It's extremely ambitious. We hope that the conditions can be created for that, and so far, based on the first experiences, as the first round of negotiations has taken place in July, and it was a good start. Certainly both sides remain committed to this fast progress, but to be frank, it's a challenge. For an agreement of such importance, such economic stakes, and such complexity, it would be something of a world record to complete it in such a short time. But that being said, both sides are fully committed to push ahead, and this is an issue which is followed with very keen interest from the highest level from both sides. So certainly the negotiators are not left on their own devices, so the political support is very clearly there. It is expected that, at least from an EU point of view, and I'm sure that your colleague from the US, Tara, will give you the other details, that from the EU point of view, once all expected results are put in place, it would give an annual boost of 0.5 percentage point to GDP. This might not seem a lot, but when you look at the present situation, when for a lot of EU member states and in recessions, for others, 0.2 or 0.3 GDP growth is now considered as a good result, then 0.5 percentage point, which would of course mean every year, would be a major boost, and turned into figures would mean a huge additional input, addition to both to GDP. In case of the EU, it would be more than 100 billion euros annually, and would give also a boost to the annual trade and investment flows. The challenges are also unprecedented. This is not the first time that a transatlantic free trade agreement has been not just thought about, but has been seriously considered. So far, the conditions were never fully right to launch it. I think that if there are good conditions, it is now, due to the situation in the world and in the economic, so both sides to the challenges from the emerging economies and the shared interest that to move forward bilaterally, as it looks like that multilateral trade liberalization is not a possibility. But it's also true that there are a number of economic, institutional, legal, and political hurdles. Some of them could be already seen at this early stage of these negotiations. It's not a secret that the adoption of the mandate for the EU has been preceded by very difficult negotiations. Some member states had particular concerns. Just to give you an example of a very high-profile issue, how to treat culture, audiovisual services, but there are also other issues. There are concerns from the EU side, but equally, I'm sure, also from the US side. But that being said, I think nobody thinks that there would be insurmountable obstacles. It will need ingenuity, imagination from the negotiators to find compromises. The process has been mentioned already. I would just perhaps add that there will be negotiating round every 2 months. The negotiations are conducted in a rather complex structure. There are some 20 negotiating groups dealing with the various elements of the talks, and I'm sure that as the time progresses, there will be even for more detailed subsectoral and regulatory discussions. So let's hope that this unprecedented exercise will lead where both sides would like to see it to be completed in a short time at a high ambition. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the chance to speak with you today. Having worked on US-EU issues for much of my career, it's particularly exciting to talk today about the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It really is a unique opportunity for the Europe and the United States to stimulate growth and create jobs. TTIP is a major priority for President Obama, Secretary Kerry, and the entire U.S. government, as well as for President Van Rompuy, President Barroso, and other European leaders. It offers an opportunity to boost economic growth and increase the more than 13 million American and European jobs already supported by transatlantic trade and investment. TTIP will also enable the United States and the EU to develop joint approaches to global trade challenges. As my colleagues have mentioned, the US-EU economic relationship is already the world's largest, accounting for, we calculate, a third of total global goods and services trade, and nearly half of global economic output. These That was factually correct, even if the microphone objected. TTIP also enables the United States and the EU to develop joint approaches to global trade challenges and form the underpinning of a strong rule-based international economic order. TTIP will further strengthen our already dynamic partnership with the European Union as a whole, but it'll also be good for Latvia specifically. By linking our two economies together more closely, we'll make it easier for businesses in Latvia to target a transatlantic marketplace with their products. This will help unleash forces of innovation that will reposition both the EU and the US economies for success in the 21st century. TTIP can provide an added boost to the strong climate of innovation, research, and development that exists in the EU and in the US. The US and Latvian economies are already closely linked. The bilateral exchange of goods, services, and investment is testament to this relationship. Latvian companies like JZ Microphones have established offices in the United States to service growing demand for their products. I'm actually told they support very famous musicians in the United States. US companies like Geld-Wen are investing and creating jobs in Latvia. With the unique opportunities afforded by TTIP, this relationship will only grow. And we recognize and appreciate that Latvia has already voiced its support for TTIP and hope TTIP can contribute to a deepening partnership between the United States and Latvia and the EU as a whole to create jobs and economic growth in both of our economies. Following extensive consultations with our Congress and stakeholders last spring, the administration, led by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, held the first round of negotiations with the European Commission in Washington in July, and we're looking forward to increased substantive engagement at the second round taking place in Brussels during the week of October 7th. Both sides have agreed to pursue a high standard agreement that tackles a broad range of areas, including pressing for full elimination of tariffs, making substantial progress on reducing unnecessary regulatory costs and non-tariff barriers, and addressing services, investment, labor, and environment, among other issues. We also agree on the particular importance of addressing the non-tariff barriers that now constitute the most significant obstacle to increased transatlantic commerce. This means working smarter, making it easier for businesses to navigate our two regulatory systems while maintaining the high level of environment, health, and safety protection that our citizens expect. As with any agreement that holds out so much promise and covers so much in its scope, we recognize there'll be challenges ahead. Both sides will have sensitivities in the TTIP negotiations, and neither of us will be able to achieve everything we want. But only a genuinely ambitious and comprehensive agreement will have a significant positive impact on our jobs and economic growth. While there are many challenges ahead, we look forward to working with the EU to find creative solutions and advancing toward our shared goal of an agreement that will create new investment, jobs, and growth that will benefit our manufacturers, our workers, our innovators, our service providers on both sides of the Atlantic. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For me, it's an honor today to speak on this conference. We had presentation prepared. So it was already mentioned by previous speakers, and certainly from Latvian perspective, I would like to as well to say that we share the same opinion that this is a crucial trade deal whatever world had, and even we are comparing maybe small economy, still it is important to follow this with highest priorities, and certainly the future trade agreement will bring benefits to both, not only to EU or US particularly, but as well to global trading system as it is itself. And the deal itself can set market opening where tariffs are in some areas certainly low. Still agriculture area could benefit our both exporters and importers on both sides of transatlantic, but more important and more complex issues are regulatory dialogues, where we can set new issues of standards for our operators, non-tariff barriers, where we are having different approaches in production processes, but still unified. They can be reducing costs to businesses and as well to society. And certainly there is probably a lot of other opportunities that could be still developed in bilateral relations. Some facts already was mentioned by previous speakers, but just process itself, it's not just started with a mandate. It started already some time ago in 2011 with establishing a high-level group, and some features of that agreement what could be included, where we could stand already was inside of this report of high-level working group. So therefore, for us, Peter Balázs already mentioned that it will be world record to conclude these negotiations by 2014 or 15, beginning of 15 or end of 14, but still, yeah, it's maybe world record would be for European Commission, but certainly the agreement itself as well is world level importance, and we as member state would be very much supportive to these negotiations, and like the timing 2015, we start our presidency in EU. If it would be at the beginning of 2015, certainly we would be working very hard with this agreement. If it's some presidencies before, as Italians, let them do it, or after, certainly. All would be happy, but I would say that this is an agenda of a lot of governments and member states, and we are all very, very much interested to follow this. So how looks Latvian economic relations with US and our bilateral trade? There was mentioned already by Sarah some of our good examples, Geldwen and our Sound Lab. There are several, certainly far more others who deal, but if we look on our export figures to US, on goods part, it was constantly increasing trade balance by reaching last year 110 million euros. On export of services, certainly we had more different picture, having some promising years. Even when we had crisis, we had higher export of our services towards US, but that shows that there are still opportunities for our companies to export their services to US more. If you look at the import statistics, certainly imports have been reduced on goods part when we had our years of economic slowdown. Now it regained, and it's growing. On import side as well, there are certainly important part of machinery, so and that's as process for goods export. Therefore, it shouldn't be worried as so much. And on side of services, we see quite stable picture, but still I think it is possible for future growth and increase. US is actually among our 5 trading partners outside EU. If we look at I already started to talk what are we having on goods, that the biggest part of we have machinery, which is almost 1/4, a little bit more, of our exports. Then the same goes for food and spirits. So that consists almost like a half of our exports to US. And there are certainly expectations for this future agreement are quite high. Other areas of industries as well are certainly important, but I think that's most important for our exporters. On import side, like I said, machinery and mechanical appliances make even more than 1/3. It's 40% of our total import from US, and that's we see as well as contribution to our development, investments for future production of one or another items where it's further links to export potential. Then it's other importances, metals and optical instruments and food and beverages, but the most important certainly area in that sector import items is machinery. For us, core issues and what we see as important topics for our further processes to go, and what is our position, certainly importance of negotiations that all parties stakeholders, governments are involved, and broad discussions are held on this agreement, as meaning this importance of this agreement, meaning what kind of new challenges could be bring. Another aspect, it is what I said already before, it is liberalization of import duties. We would certainly be in a position that it would be almost free trade, not only in industrial products, but as well in agriculture products. Yeah, we could see some transitional periods, some flexibilities for most sensitive products, but overall we would certainly be advocating positions that it should be really free trade in market access. Then goes the agreement's more valuable part, non-tariff barriers, which creates for businesses, for societies, a lot of headaches, a lot of burden to get to each other market, and certainly as well for negotiators the most difficult, how to find common agreements on removing these non-trade barriers or having common standards and that. And for us, areas of importance would be pharmaceuticals, chemical and processed food products, where would be certainly focusing our major interest. Then other issues of importance, it is GMOs, that we can ensure right information for our consumers. Consumers are aware about what they are having and what kind of products they can use. This is intellectual property right, particularly criminal enforcement issues, which is in our position that it should be excluded from the negotiations, and public procurement issues. Then what we see as further activities of Latvia, it was mentioned that maybe not very active are at this stage process in Latvia on this agreement. Certainly there were several consultations with stakeholders already before we entered in the negotiations. We approved mandate. But since negotiations started, we are in the process of having special group, working group, who consists not only of civil servants, but certainly as well of businesses, business representatives who would follow all this agreement from Latvian side, analyzing the future documents and the positions where could be further developments. And like already 2014 September, we see that it should be already certainly period where are some deliveries, where is already seen the gains and benefits what is for this agreement. And we were discussing that we could have 2014 before conclusion of this agreement, or before our presidency. Let's hope it's like I said, it was as conclusion of this agreement. Seminar with US business, with our business, maybe Baltic business, on this TTIP issues, and further on, if it's 2015 and it's not yet concluded, I mentioned it's our presidency, certainly transatlantic agenda will be high priority as well for us to follow to these negotiations and to deal with these negotiations. And on that I would like to conclude for the moment, and thank you, and would be interested to listen further questions.
Thank you, and I come inevitably as the fourth person, hoping not to repeat anything or everything too much that others have already said. I do fear that you may be in the box seat to complete the agreement in early 2015, and that Latvia could play a part. And I think that there are two things that I really want to focus on in the next few minutes. The first is the political leadership that will be required to deliver TTIP. And the second is the level of importance of TTIP, particularly less taking into account the large numbers that we've heard, but more taking into account some of the stories that I and doubtless others who have been talking about TTIP have been hearing from individual businesses, other organisations, about how TTIP could really make a difference to them. So, in terms of the role of Latvia, well, I'm pleased to say this is my third visit to Latvia. The first came a year after independence. The second came a year after joining the EU. So I'm hoping to break the mold this time. This is in advance of something else momentous for Latvia, your first EU presidency, and hopefully the signing of this TTIP under your presidency. We've already heard how many difficult issues there will be, and we've also heard that the time is right. And I think the two things go together. The time is right this time, because at the moment we have that commitment from our political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic that this is the thing to do. That this time we can reach agreement on these difficult issues, on the issues such as GMO, on various agriculture issues, various regulations. It will be terrifically difficult. I don't think anybody is thinking this is going to be easy. And if any of you do have answers to how we can do this, will be love to hear them during the discussion that follows. It will be difficult, but I think the will is there. Certainly on the part of my own government, our Prime Minister is fully committed. We have set up a special new team within our civil service to focus exclusively on TTIP. TTIP is very much part of our Prime Minister's vision of what the EU can be like, an outward-facing EU, a competitive EU, an EU that delivers benefits for all of its citizens and for businesses. Hence the importance of TTIP. I was talking on Thursday to some visitors I had from Italy who have the previous presidency to Latvia, and I fear they don't quite think they're going to finish in time, and that you will be left to therefore do it. And I think this is a great opportunity. But seriously, there will doubtless be much to discuss, and I think you will be well placed to broker an agreement of the sort that will be needed. And I think next year, at the moment, we are in the kind of still the honeymoon period. We're all very excited about the opportunities. By next year, we will be deep in the detail of some of this, and it'll be then where we will need everybody to stand up and say, this is important, we really need to keep working on this. And so turning to why it's so important, we've heard the big numbers, but I've been working across the UK and hearing from some of our small businesses and other organisations. I've also been hearing from some of them across other member states. The smaller stories. This isn't just a case of large enterprises benefiting. I was quite taken with one woman who was actually a US citizen who had set up a business, though, in my hometown in the UK, manufacturing sweets, healthy sweets, candies, and it took her something like between a year and 18 months to get all the approvals that she needed to export these from the EU to the US and to make sure all the labelling was right. A huge amount of time. She's done very well now. She has that agreement, but what a huge time that she had to wait for that. I heard last week in another member state about a theatre troupe that had taken 12 months to get visas. I don't know if there's any more to this story, but 12 months to get visas to perform in California. That's something that we can do something about. We have small manufacturers or reasonably large manufacturers of porcelain and china in the UK, but some of their products have a tariff of 26% in the US. And incidentally, I should add that these are stories from a UK and an EU perspective into the US. I've read some testimonies from the US, and they have the same going the other direction. And these are important. I heard from one of our car manufacturers that they make the same. The car looks the same in the EU and the US, but it's designed right from the start in a completely different way with completely different set of products, even though it's equally safe, because it has to be for the different regulatory systems. And again, think of the wasted effort, and think of how EU and US competitiveness can be boosted by aligning those regulations. There are doubtless hundreds, thousands more such stories, but it's those kind of things. How can we align the regulations? We haven't really mentioned the things that happen at borders. How can we make sure that it's easy to get products through borders? So important for small and medium enterprises. How can we make sure that tariffs are reduced? And in all of these cases, there will be voices on both sides who say, well, I'm fully in favour of TTIP, but in my industry, we need a certain level of protection. And that is where I come back to the political leadership. That is where we will need the leaders to say, well, we may need to look at your industry generally, but we are not going to just protect your industry. We are going to grow the competitiveness in both the EU and the US, and we are going to sign a comprehensive TTIP, which I think we're all agreed on. So I think I'll finish at that point.
Well, thank you to each of you for these initial remarks, and I will open up the floor to questions in one moment. Maybe I will start. Both the Commission and the U.S. have now reaffirmed their commitments to a broad agreement, a maximalist agreement, as it was stated. Could you fill in a little more details as to what progress was made in July and what is really expected to occur now in Brussels in 2 weeks? If there is going to be an agreement, there's very little time before 2015. Was the low-hanging fruit picked in Washington and expected in Brussels? Or is there any real move towards this regulatory convergence, which is the really difficult stuff that needs to be handled now during the honeymoon period with the political leadership that's required? And is there evidence that the political leadership is actually pushing for particular compromises now already, or is that naive to be thinking so early? Thank you.
To be frank, I think that it is still too early to talk about compromises, because what has happened at this first meeting is to setting out negotiating approaches, conceptual discussion, first of all, agreeing on the structure and also putting forward the basic approaches. We are not even at the stage now where each side would have put forward offers. It will take some time. So these negotiations have to be, first of all, set on a sound and agreed basis, when the parties do not speak past each other, but where there is agreement what to speak about. And if one wants to look at the challenges, even when it comes to the simplest tariffs, while in the case of industrial products, the tariff protection is on average equally low, around 4% for both sides. But within these tariffs, totally different sectors are protected at a high than at a low level. So in this case, which tariffs should be eliminated first, immediately, or which tariffs need more time? And then come the much more difficult situation. David made a reference to the cars. Really, the car sector is one of the best examples, which is heavily traded internationally, but still the regulatory approaches are quite different. Therefore, it's true not just for the EU and US manufacturers, but even third countries, that they have to produce totally differently depending where they want to export. And this takes me perhaps to an important point. If these negotiations will be successful, third countries will also benefit a lot. Because it doesn't mean that only the exporters from the two sides would be able to have the advantages of scale, but it will be also good news for third countries. But getting back to your basic question, I think that it will still need some time before we really get to the real substance of the negotiations. I think that it is more end of this year or early next year when the most difficult issues will come to the surface.
I agree with everything Peter just said. I think, responding to your question, I think the low-hanging fruit was actually picked and eaten long ago. So low-hanging fruit is really not what this negotiation is going to be about. This is the negotiation about what's more difficult, what's more entrenched into very mature, developed systems. And I think what's extraordinary about this is the amount of political will on both sides that we've seen, from the commitment on the U.S. side and the commitment on the European side, to tackle these hard issues. And in terms of what we're looking for and what we've discussed, ambitious, comprehensive, high standard agreement, I completely agree with Peter. This benefits the U.S. and the EU, but this is also an agreement, I think, with global implications. If we agree on a standard, then our combined economies are such that really begins to set a global standard that benefits other countries attempting to produce and deliver worldwide. So I think there should be no illusions that the agreement will conclude quickly for quickly's sake. I think really the substance of the negotiation will drive when the agreement concludes. And these are difficult issues, but the fact that both sides are actually willing to tackle them, I think, is very new. Everything on your slide, I lived all of that. I worked on the high-level working group. I worked on the tech before that. Long ago, we had a transatlantic economic partnership. I worked on that. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen this level of political will on both sides to actually tackle what's difficult and actually move forward to make progress in some of these issues.
And I'm going to just add, I think, that it's not just the goodwill and the ideas coming from the EU and the US. I've not seen, similar point, to follow on, I've not seen such a level of energy coming from business organizations, trade bodies, consumer organizations, with such a raft of ideas as well. And that some of that thinking is still maturing, and that should, in an ideal world, feed in timing-wise, that the industry bodies, having put their first thoughts forward, discovered that actually they're in roughly the right place, and yes, we are very interested in what they have to say, are now refining, and that will hopefully then feed into the next couple of rounds of negotiations where there's some really substantive ideas coming from various groups.
I really agree with that. As you're developing the actual substance of the negotiation, it's so important to take into account the stakeholder input, and that input is extensive and thoughtful. We did a consultation in the beginning of July in the U.S. We had 50 presentations from different industry groups, consumer groups, what they want to see in an agreement. We did a briefing. We had even more participants come to that, and it takes time to make sure you're properly sifting through what your stakeholders are telling you they want to see, and how do you concretize that in the actual negotiation moving forward.
Well, the floor is open. Is my microphone working?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. If you have a question, then please identify yourself, and we'll give you the microphone.
Tatiana Moravska, Professor, University of Latvia and Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Thank you very much, first of all, for the opinions expressed and interesting examples. What I would like to say that this topic is absolutely important for all of us and for me, for the audience in the classrooms. I had the pleasure in this July at the beginning to be at the Bruegel Foundation in Brussels for the similar discussion with the representatives from the DG Trade. And one of the issues that were discussed at that point, not only regulation and standardization that is so different, and we have the examples of it, but also the gains from this agreement, gains for the member states. They might be different for the richer member states and for the less developed member states. What would be your opinion? Maybe there is some progress already made. And another issue that I think it's interesting, we are discussing CETA agreement with Canada, the European Union. So to what extent these agreements are similar, different, and is it taken into consideration as experience of CETA in negotiations with the US? Thank you very much.
Well, I think that I should try to reply these questions. First of all, when it comes to gains for various member states. First of all, the intensity of transatlantic trade is certainly different for various member states, both for traditions, economic and even geographic reasons. So certainly the smaller and, for instance, landlocked countries within the EU have less traditions to have direct trade with the US. But I don't think that, on the other hand, that these gains are linked to the size or even to the economic development of member states. It's linked to what role they play in the, if you want, in the production chains. It's even for the largest countries, it's increasingly rare that they would be able to produce everything from raw material up to the finished products themselves. Normally, everything is produced now by increasing the complex production chains. The end figures of the products, of the finished products, the trade in finished products is misleading. Very often, the finished products, and it's especially true in the case of EU, they contain the supplies, the subcontractor role or supplier role of hundreds of small and medium-sized enterprises, and in case of the EU, probably from a dozen or more of member states. A German high-end car, which is exported to the US, it contains probably some parts and components from every member state, from Latvia, which has a sub-supplier, to Spain. And and this might not show up in the figures. Maybe that the EU-Latvia or the EU-Spanish transatlantic trade doesn't show such an increase, then in this example, the US-Latvian and US-Spanish trade will not increase to such an extent than the US-German trade. But in the German finished product, there might be a lot of value added from other member states. And therefore, it's important to look behind the gross figures. And we are convinced that this will benefit, to a large extent, each member state, and I would say indirectly each citizen of the European Union by the enhanced economic growth and trade. The CETA, the EU-Canada agreement, is similarly a broad and ambitious agreement. It covers similarly a very broad range of products, even if the economic importance is necessarily less due to the less intensive relations than the TTIP would be. But that's true that certain challenges have been found already there. Canada has a federal setup like the US. One issue which has been a case there and which will be an issue also in the EU-US negotiations, how and to what extent cover sub-federal levels. When it comes to services, when it comes to public procurement, these are important issues to be clarified. So there are certain conclusions and certain experiences which might be helpful also in the case of the US. On the other hand, due to the different size, there are different challenges. In case of Canada, a big question was how to deal with the fact that the Canadian economy very often adds only a limited value added to products imported from elsewhere, first of all from the US. This won't be a major concern in the EU-US relationship because the US economy is big enough to provide a lot of value added which needed to enjoy the benefits of the preferential treatment of the free trade agreement.
I maybe add a couple of points on the. I think I was at the same seminar. The most important thing, the people who did this particular survey showed a map of the EU and how much each member state would gain in this particular worked example. Everybody gained. So although we gained in different percentages, no EU member state was poorer as a result of TTIP. So I think that is an important point. There are many studies being done which show different numbers, and I think those numbers were slightly different to the study that the Commission produced. Slightly different numbers, but I think that the general point holds.
Maybe I'll just follow up this question regarding the role of small countries such as Latvia. We saw the data from the Economics Ministry. But behind that data, I believe in 2012, only 1.21% of Latvia's exports went to the United States. So there's a question of what are the barriers that lead to such a small number, and are the negotiations really going to ensure also not the rights but the interests of the smaller countries, or is this a negotiation for the bigger Western European countries and the United States?
I think this isn't just a conversation about small countries and large countries. It's a conversation about small and medium-sized businesses too, because a lot of the market barriers for those companies are really the transaction costs, the costs of compliance. And so to the extent an agreement like this will tackle those compliance costs, those regulatory procedures that make it too daunting for a small and medium-sized company to attempt to enter the market, the growth and the ability of those kinds of companies to export or to provide services, I think will be a significant benefit of this agreement.
Maybe from perspective of Latvia, yes, you just mentioned the figures, and maybe they are not so big as we would like to see, but certainly Latvia and its economy, we are very close to global value chains. So our companies produced different spare parts, different products which are further used in or German cars or some other, like we have company, they are producing cables each for car drives with Latvia, cables produced in Latvia, for example. And that certainly you don't see on traditional statistics, but when you go to statistics analyzing who goes where, analyzing global value chain, certainly you see as well benefits on that. But these negotiations, in my opinion, really are not about between member states, which member state in EU gains more or less. It's certain that EU gains and US gains on these negotiations, and as well our surveys with our businesses shows that it's not import tariffs which is barriers for them. Regulatory issues takes the most of costs. And these are barriers sometimes for small and medium companies which are not bearable. How to get these licenses, how to understand the system. And if there is even small unification in one or other area, it already gives benefits to them.
Next question, please.
Yes, thank you for the presentations, and I agree with most of what has been said. And I'm the Belgian ambassador, the ambassador of Belgium in Riga, and the Belgian government really supports all the objectives which are pursued during those negotiations. I asked this question from my previous position when I was representative for Belgium in the Environment Working Group of the European Union. And my question is that the key words I heard today is about liberalization, about level playing field. I think most people speaking here are people from the trade environment. And my concern is when we create this level playing field in the market, what will be, are there any risks for the protection level that we have now in society, both in the United States and in Europe? In the European acquis, there is a high level of protection, both on product safety, environmental protection, safety of workers protection, and so on. Is there a risk that through those negotiations that there is a pressure exerted, especially in negotiating non-tariff barriers, that there is a created a level playing field, but at a lower level, with a lower level of protection? Thank you very much.
I think this is a very important question, and this has come up already in the preparatory process of these negotiations, and this is a question often raised not just from member states, but even more from the civil society, from non-governmental organizations, be it dealing in environment, consumer protection, health, and all other aspects. The truth is that there are differences in the regulatory philosophies and the means of regulations, but very often these differences are more about how the protection is provided and not to what extent protection is provided. Just to give a simple example, that it's true that in case of the EU, the protection for consumers is more provided by government regulation. In the US, while there might be also government regulation, sometimes when it comes to health, I don't think that, for instance, the FDA, I think, would have any lower standards than in EU member states, but very often in the US, the danger of liability and litigation for companies who do not look after the interests of consumers and who do not make sure that the health requirements are fully met, it's at least as strong a disciplining force as it's in the EU. There are, on the other hand, certainly differences, but to be frank, with President Obama's policies then less than they were when it comes to issues like impacts on the climate change. Here, especially during the previous administration, there were even fundamental differences, whether this is a real risk or not. I think that now there is a somewhat different approach, and there is an intention to work together. Again, to give a practical example, when the EU introduced its emission trading system and extended to air transport, there was a very strong international objection, protests from the US, but also from many other countries as well. From the EU side, we listened to it, and there was first a decision to extend this measure by 1 year, and now a further extension subject to finding a true international agreement in the international body ICAO dealing with air transport. So there are possibilities to deal in a perhaps agreed manner with this kind of differences, but on the other hand, I have no doubt that we will hear a lot about how to regulate in details the regulation, for instance, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. There is no question either for the EU, for the US, to dismantle their existing legislation, but looking at ways how to apply it in a more flexible manner, allowing increased trade. These will be the real challenges of negotiations.
I would just add to that the intention of these negotiations is not at all to lower standards. The intention from the get-go is a recognition that both the U.S. and the EU are committed to high standards of environment, health, safety, protection. I think Peter said a very important word, which is how. I think we share common goals, and most of our discussions and challenges is around the how we implement those goals. And even in the ETS example that he used, the emission trading scheme that's now being discussed at ICAO, not a disagreement that emissions, for example, are part of a conversation, but how best to mitigate the climate effect. Is it a tax or is it some other way? And it's those kind of differences across regulatory issues, different decisions on how to get to the same result that I think will be a subject of discussion, not a discussion about, oh, should we bring our standards lower? Our hope is by setting an ambitious implementation between ourselves, we're actually raising global standards, that we're actually creating a standard that's usable beyond just the EU, but in other countries that maybe don't have that level of protection, whether it's health, safety, environment, etc. This is the optimist dream, but this is where we hope to go.
And I want to be fair-minded. We're trying to be fair-minded in the UK to this. We've had a number of people come to us and say this is an opportunity to raise standards in this area, and we say no, this is a trade negotiation. It's not we don't want to raise it. And we've had a number who say we'd like to lower standards in this area, and we say no, this is a trade negotiation. The point being, those discussions are perfectly valid in so many areas, but not. This is, I think. We would all be terribly in agreement. This is really about seeing the areas where we very much are in agreement roughly around the levels of protection. There will be areas, to be fair, where the approaches are just so different, or the goals are really so different that it will be difficult. We'll try and, I hope, some progress will be made. I'll give another example as well. The EU's chemicals approach, REACH, is just so different to that in the US. It seems difficult to see that there will be able to be huge movement there. There are other things that can be done in that sector which will hopefully create more alignment. But where there's that kind of difference, I don't see a major change. I was also interested. I've sort of, I wouldn't say I've fully read, but I've looked through some of the public evidence that was given to Congress that you organised, and we have to be fair here. We assume we have the best standards in the EU, but there are quite a few people who say in X area or Y area. In the US, they're saying the EU standards aren't very good. We have better standards in the US. So let's not assume that our standards are better in the EU.
Hello, Philippe Bravard from the French Embassy. I'm the economic counselor. So maybe a few comments about what I heard. Of course, each member state does support this free trade agreement in between EU and USA. We need 1 point or 2 points of growth. It's quite crucial for any states. Regarding to how to protect the high level of protection, I have a few comments. First of all, in Europe, we have what we call, European social choice. It means that, to be concrete, we have in mind, we have the European consumer. He used to have a special approach to, a few issues like, GMO, like growth hormones, like, chemical decontamination of meat, and so on. It's not only, a question of tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers. It's something more looking close to philosophy of life. So we have to take into account, such things. And I think, the The Commission has a very hard mandate, but also the civil society is also requesting from the Commission, you know, a very good work, and there is no doubt that there will be. First of all, don't forget that we have also free negotiation with South Korea, Canada, Japan also, and it takes also time with this country. I would like also to remember that inside this agreement there will be a special chapter dedicated to audiovisual services. As you know, many countries are concerned by this aspect, and it's clear that it will be also very interesting to see how to protect, you know, cultural diversity, which one of the main pillars of European construction. And I think maybe from the Commission it will be interesting to know how your mandate will face this difficulty. And don't forget also that, of course, we talk about, you know, a businessman which will be happy to export more, but we have also key issues in different sectors, like, you know, liberalization of procurement in defense industry, which is also a key aspect of such agreement. So thank you. Sorry to have asked so many questions.
Who would like to start?
I'm sorry, but as this relates to European regulations and European standards, so unavoidable, but I don't want to take always the floor first. But first of all, what is an issue, and it has come out on the preparatory process, and also during already the negotiations so far, that while we work on the basis of a single mandate, it's also true that behind there are different approaches and different practices even among member states. GMO has been mentioned as one example. Some member states are allowing more GMOs, even cultivation, others completely prohibited. This is a fact. There is different approach, but this is what the Commission has to deal with and to find solutions which are acceptable for all. Or the audiovisual services. Again, there are very big differences among member states to what extent they wish to use the opportunity provided by the EU regulation of limiting the non-European contents. Some member states take it very thoroughly, and I think that France is certainly is among them, while others, frankly, they are not too much hung up about the exact percentage of non-European works. So these are differences which show the diversity and the color of the member states of the EU, and against these different approaches and different interests, we will have to find solutions which, on the one hand, meet the views of the EU membership as EU member states as a totality, and on the other hand, they are also acceptable for the EU. But these challenges, I think that they make our work only more interesting.
I think these last two questions actually illustrate the difficulty of the task at hand. As an example, the processed frozen chickens that they make out in Czechova, I'm sure they're just as safe in Belgium and in California, and the difficulty is how to convince Belgians that they're just as safe and Californians, and how to get them to market in California and Brussels. That's the real difficulty. And regarding the philosophical differences, I think that's certainly agreed, and everyone recognizes that. The question is, can those be overcome? If everyone truly wants an agreement, comprehensive agreement, it will require probably compromise on both sides on these philosophical differences as well. And how do we get there by Latvia's presidency of the EU?
Ines Denboga, head of representation of the European Commission in Latvia. Well, first of all, I'm really pleased that these debates are in the center of attention of our guests, and I'm very pleased that Peter Balázs, despite very busy September, kindly accepted our invitation and is with us today. Actually, these debates are aiming at raising awareness of Latvian people about TTIP. The topic is perhaps not very sexy, I must say, because, for the time being, in the center of public debates in Latvia, there is a euro accession. Some other issues, but euro accessions first. The presidency will come a little bit later. As to TTIP, I must say that I have not noticed many publications, I would say very, very few, in the Latvian press. And even today we have invited not only ambassadors, but also some of opinion leaders in Latvian, but only a few of them accepted our invitation. I'm just wondering what is the situation in the UK, where I know that this is one of priorities of the UK government. What about the public, which is generally not very pro-European, and what is the role of this negotiation in perhaps changing the public mind a little bit? What about the US? Are the American people interested in these potential benefits? And well, this is my general issue. Thank you for answering.
This is good. We give you a break, Peter. I was waiting for this one. Interestingly enough, two weeks ago, I was at a meeting, listening in on a meeting between UK members of Parliament and US senators, and one of the biggest questions they discussed was how to bridge the divide between MPs, other opinion formers, and the general public. So I think everybody this question comes up repeatedly. In terms of how does this play into the EU debate in the UK, it certainly forms a part. I think it would be fair to say that TTIP is a popular concept across the political spectrum in the UK. When we had a change of government in 2010 between Labour and Conservative, in terms of the approach to trade policy generally, there wasn't too much difference. The former EU Trade Commissioner was a Labour minister, but his policies would be, I think, very similar. So this is one thing. In terms of the level of public debate, a little. It is not necessarily the case that you're doing badly here because there's not very much. We have many business organisations and large businesses are very interested, and some of our think tank organisations, some of them, but it's not as if there have been hundreds of articles. It hasn't yet reached that kind of breaking out stage. I think as trade talks go, it's done quite well to reach a certain level. It could go further. I think if we started to address, if people started to believe that it was going to address some of the issues we've been talking about, I think we might see the interest growing. The opposite could, of course, also happen, that people will think, oh, maybe it's not going to work. So I think much of the onus is on collectively, as all but particularly, I'm afraid, the Commission and the US to make progress such that the debate continues, and hopefully more and more people will get interested in what this will mean and the opportunities that it will bring.
Maybe a little bit from our ministry's perspective, or how we see this public awareness issue. Certainly, I think at the moment the negotiations are at the stage where it's just concepts exchange, and interests are really at the more core issues. We join to Euro, we do that. Some of our internal issues are more on agenda than TTIP. But if I compare interest of business societies, other stakeholders, on one or another trade issues, that certainly I should say this was an issue which was taken with serious interest, with commitments from business organizations, and with the wish to follow and go closer for talks and process, to be involved in this process, as getting information where we stand, what we could do, where is our expertise, and so on. And like Ina said, certainly we will join Euros and we will start our presidency discussions, and there will be coming as well TTIP with all the substances, and I hope already on that time we will really have not just concepts but already real deliveries, what we could tell to our businesses and what we could discuss, where we could do more or what we could do together, not to mislead ourselves. Thank you.
Did you want to know the U.S. price? Yeah, in the U.S. there has been quite a bit of press coverage, but again, as others are describing at the conceptual level, the fact that the level of ambition for this discussion is high, and this kind of commitment to tackling the difficult issues has created quite a bit of press attention, and I think it's helpful that stakeholder groups that are interested in it going forward are also interacting with the press, because I think that that makes it more tangible for normal people to see how this could eventually benefit them. I would say that TTIP is not something that, you know, is being talked about at the pub. You know, my mom never brings it up. But at the level of press attention and ideas that this could be very, very exciting, I think that's where we are. And I agree, as we go forward and more of sort of the substance and the tangible stories of how this could benefit producers, consumers, other groups in the countries, I think it will continue to gain press attention.
Next question, please.
Kaspars Adjāns, Latvian newspaper Diena. We have talked about some economical issues and even some environmental issues, but there are still some political issues as well. And on one hand, we have the Snowden case, the Edward Snowden case. On the other hand, we have the slow European reaction, for example, for for a military intervention in Syria. And I want to ask how that could affect the talks, the TTIP talks. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you, as far as the EU is concerned, none. These are not subjects for these negotiations. These are very important political issues, but this is a free trade agreement. This is about a deep and comprehensive agreement about liberalizing economic exchanges, and there are political issues involved to a certain extent, but it's more, as mentioned, social and other issues. When it comes to external policies, foreign policies, this is simply not subject of these negotiations.
Catherine Ashton said that the European Union could overview the discussions on the trade partnership after Edward Snowden case went out.
The only issue I am aware of is that the question of privacy data protection has come up, on which a separate discussion has been launched between the United States and the EU, but it is not part of the TTIP negotiations. These are issues, important issues, but this we can just hope, because these are issues in the focus of interest for many people, and politically clearly very sensitive issues, that solutions and understandings will be found, which will create the necessary positive environment for the moving ahead and completing the TTIP negotiations. But these are not directly on the agenda, this kind of issues of the negotiations.
Thanks. My question is about third countries. You mentioned that third countries will benefit from the economies of scale that would develop from TTIP. And also you mentioned at the beginning, Peter, that movement in a bilateral trade negotiation might provide some impetus to multilateral negotiations. My question is specifically about, say, China, India, Brazil. Are we talking to those countries specifically about the consequences and implications of TTIP, or are we letting them draw their own conclusions, or are we sort of not yet at that stage? I was at a conference just a couple of weeks ago talking about TTIP, and I was surprised at the amount of attention being given to the third country questions of Brazil, China, India, and so on.
Well, as far as the EU concerned, but I leave to Tara the US side of it, but as far as the EU concerned, we certainly are ready to talk to countries who are interested. We assure them that we expect from these negotiations trade creation and not trade diversion. Because, of course, the big fear that it will divert trade from, for instance, the EU with these countries into the EU-US relationship. We think that the economic benefits are so great if this works out that everybody will benefit. I give the example of the, if you want a single regulatory space in certain areas where the regulations of both large markets would be either uniform or considered as equivalent, which would ensure that they have easier possibilities to export. Also by setting international standards, which could, or standards which can become subsequently international standards, it could have really a more global impact. And last but not least, at least for two of these countries, the possibility as far as the EU is concerned is there to enjoy the benefits of preferential trade. We negotiate with the Mercosur countries, including Brazil, unfortunately for over 15 years. A free trade agreement which, however, never wants to come to fruition. I very much hope that this won't be anything like that when it comes to the TTIP. But we think in Brussels at least that this is not due to the fault of the EU, especially Argentina, let's put it politely, not the poster child for liberal trade these days, and it certainly, their attitude doesn't have the completion of these negotiations, but the possibility is there, and we several times attempted from the EU side to revive the negotiations. Similarly, we have advanced negotiations with India, and it is only with the upcoming elections that it looks like that India has now slowed down the advance of these negotiations, but this possibility remains open. Even when it comes to China, we are trying, not even if not a comprehensive free trade agreement, but now to launch negotiations about an investment agreement. So the TTIP on the one hand has indirect positive effects, and on the other hand, there is, from the EU side, there is openness for parallel negotiations with the large emerging economies.
No, I think that's right. This is not intended as a bigger thy neighbor type of negotiation. This is a negotiation that will benefit the U.S. and EU but also potentially be of great benefit more broadly. And it doesn't preclude other conversations and other fora to try to make progress with this particular combination of countries as we move forward.
And I can recommend reading the People's Daily of China. I used to have to do this. They're very interested. I think you can safely say that. I mean, to be fair, they're even more interested in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US is negotiating with another group of countries, and which was at least 3 or 4 months ago subject to several articles denouncing it in various ways. Although then they changed their mind slightly and didn't denounce it so much and said they might join it. So it's quite interesting. But they're certainly very interested. And I've noticed that lots of people from other countries are kind of asking these questions. How will it affect us? I imagine those conversations are happening at various levels. I've certainly had a few conversations with people just generally curious, really. I've not had the sense, though, that people have been saying this is going to wreck the WTO or anything else. I think it's more curious, and also, what does it mean for them? And I think the answer is the one we've already heard. If there is a single regulatory space, then that's of a great deal of interest.
Next question, please. I have a question for Latvia and maybe other countries in the region. There was an article by Edward Lucas, I think in August. He's at The Economist, frequent visitor to Latvia, probably a friend to many in the room here. He wrote that in the context of TTIP, that in the context of the drawdown of U.S. military spending in Europe and Europe's refusal to fund additional military capability, that over time NATO will cease to be the central transatlantic tie between Europe and the United States, Baltic states, and the United States. And he, of course, argues that this should be replaced by this trade and investment partnership. And he also argued that the biggest that the Central and Eastern European countries, including Latvia, that this TTIP should be of greatest priority to them in this security context, because the biggest winners with a successful TTIP to maintain U.S. involvement in the transatlantic relationship would be, say, the Baltics and the Central and Eastern European countries, and the biggest losers could also be the same countries if the U.S. really loses interest in Europe and turns and pivots, as it is, to Asia Pacific. I wonder if there's any discussion with your colleagues in the region as to the importance of TTIP for this particular security, consideration.
I would certainly first start with an economic benefits. I think in region, Baltics, Nordics, Baltics further, or EU 28, certainly we all seen the benefits of economic gains. We see the benefits as well, not only for EU, as well for US. And like it was as well discussed now, that if we succeed in one or another area for regulatory standards, it can even gain other nations worldwide. Therefore, I think importance is on economic part. We all benefit from common external trade policy in EU, and therefore kind of dividing Baltics will lose if that will not succeed, or Baltics will lose. Certainly there is bilateral agenda between Baltics and US, and it is important topic. It is a priority for Latvia. Relations with US was and always will be as priority for us. Economic, political, security, any kind of economic and political cooperation, and therefore I think I would like to keep it. Yes, we will gain from that, then our interest is that all gains from this agreement. There are not losers on that agreement.
I'll just pick up on that a little. I mean, firstly, it's a nice kind of parlor game to write articles in the Economist and wherever about the EU-US relationship, particularly in the wake of the US's strategic pivot to Asia, and there were lots of people writing articles about what this meant. I guess there is an element of for the EU of making sure that we continue to be relevant and important for the US, but I don't really see that across the whole region that's going to cease to be the case.
I don't have the benefit of having read the article, but I would say that I think it would be a sensationalist approach to read that our relationship hangs by the thread of this one trade agreement. I think this will be of enormous benefit to both sides as we proceed with these trade negotiations, but I think our commitment economically, politically, security-wise to Europe has not changed and will not rise and fall based on one trade negotiation. And I would say, in looking at the pivot to Asia, that's paying more attention to Asia, but Europe is the cornerstone of our global engagement strategy all over the world, and I think reading into it that figuring out how to engage with Asia more intelligently means that we don't have enough mental space to engage with Europe would be not the right way to look at how we approach policy.
Perhaps the reply would be one word: like-mindedness. There is no two regions of the world, like the two sides of the Atlantic, where there would be such high level of similar approaches, similar ways of thinking than between the EU and the US. When it comes to the fundamental basics of basic elements of democracy, the market economy, rule of law, while there are elements, and we hope to see even more and more in the emerging economies, but we are not there yet that we could say that that level of like-mindedness would exist between either the EU or the US and any other part of the world. And I think that this remains a long-term link. And the second point, that when it comes to the final difficult decisions about the TTIP, then in the end those will be political decisions. It's not just that we need political support during the process, but in the end, certain political judgment has to be made between competing interests of offensive and defensive sectors, between the interests of industry and services, or the people interested in government procurement and agriculture, and these decisions will have to be made at the level of the heads of governments, be it in the US or be it in the EU, or in the case of the EU, through the Council. So in the end, when it comes to high stake agreements, then this unavoidably is also not just economic but political.
Thank you. We have 15 more minutes for questions. Please.
Sorry to come back for a second question, but I had a question to Madame Liepina. One of the main selling points for Latvia as a trading nation is its position as a transit country, as a gateway to the east between the EU and the east, Russia, Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Do you think that this TTIP will have an effect in any way on the position of Latvia as being this transit country to the east? Will it be a beneficial effect or negative, or what's your opinion? Thank you.
like I said, this is one of area, yes, where we are having our strengths. This is a transit country between East and West. And for sure, more trade between transatlantic brings more goods to European Union, and more goods to European Union brings more goods to further, it's Russia being, or Kazakhstan, or some other countries in East. Certainly. But it's just one of the areas where we see benefits. I think there are all over issues in all areas. Starting with agriculture issues, food processing, and all the industries, what we are talking, machinery, chemical, pharmaceuticals, there will be great benefits if we succeed with this agreement.
Well, there are certainly many difficult areas to negotiate. I wonder if the panel has any view on which are the easiest of the difficult areas. If we're talking digital economy, data transfers, data privacy, are those easier than, say, pharmaceuticals or GMOs? Or can you look into a crystal ball? Where are the ones that are we most likely will see some progress in 2 or 3 years?
As far as I think you, of course, first of all, we hope that progress will be less than 2 or 3 years, but let's be maximum 2, let's put it that way. But being more serious, certainly when it comes to tariff dismantling in the non-sensitive industrial products, where there are common interests, high-tech products, that is certainly, it won't be a too controversial area. We have, after all, the EU and the US are jointly pushing internationally in Geneva to have a further liberalization under the Information Technology Agreement, ITA, and there our interests completely match. So I don't think that this would be a problematic area. There are also many business-related services where I don't think that there would be difference of interest. These are typically not very sensitive issues. Even I would think that in agriculture, when it comes to processed products, there is an interest from both sides. But the areas which I didn't mention, by definition, will be more difficult, possibly for both sides. Core agricultural products. Meat, dairy, sugar, these are the big ticket items. What to do about more sensitive industrial products? What to do about services where more, if you want, strategic services, financial services, where there might be already differences in approach. But the fact is that the fundamental approach to this negotiation is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So we cannot have just a kind of what you could say low-hanging fruit, agree on the easy items and then call it a day. It will not and cannot happen. We have to work also to deal with the more difficult areas as well, because even if this might be a later agreement which evolves over time, but it must be self-balancing right from the start.
I am not tempted to add anything to that.
Maybe customs and trade facilitation might be in the easier bracket. I would hopefully add that one. I'll be more optimistic. Automotive, you have an enormous amount of thinking going on among industry and various others, and it won't be easy. But with the level of work that's going on there certainly should be a good chance, and there don't look to be there doesn't look to be anything fundamental. I mentioned earlier that chemicals has something fundamental where there is a problem. There doesn't look to be anything quite so fundamental in automotive. Could be famous last words. I hope I'm not tempting fate.
Well, from my perspective, like we said, these are negotiations of crucial importance. We said they will be very difficult. I wish that all sectors which seems difficult goes easy with negotiations, which certainly I wish, but like it is huge interest from both sides on any of these sectors, but it can be always in negotiations from experience. One or another sector which seems easy sometimes becomes the most difficult one, and vice versa. One or another sector which seems really difficult, when you start to sort the issue, it depends very much how deep you are prepared, and then doesn't seem anymore so difficult. So that would be approach maybe to look how we go for this negotiation. But probably industrial goods, I think market access on industrial goods shouldn't be difficult. I don't say that it should be that we are not having zeros on that, like we have with our trading partners, but of course we are in hands of Commission. They are negotiating on behalf of member states, and we will evaluate. I think that future standards for new technologies could be an issue where it's important to agree on common regulation, and therefore if it's rightly communicated between industries, regulatory setting institutions, it could be an area where we can have a lot of progress and not so difficult issues. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Cowley, the British Ambassador. And thank you to the panel for a very interesting discussion. It's very good to hear you're positive about some aspects of the agreement, and good to be brave and say what you think those areas might be. We've talked a lot this afternoon about the trade aspects of TTIP, but we haven't said quite so much about the investment side of what this agreement might mean. So I'd be really interested in the views from all of the panel about how you think the agreement might have positive impacts on investment in the EU and in the US. And a particular question about Latvia, as Latvia is looking to attract more investment into your infrastructure and other parts of your economy, how you think that this agreement might be positive for Latvia on the investment side as well. Thank you.
I will say with just one word, yes, we are completely sure that it will be very positive towards investments. As bringing more trade, more economic relations, and more investments to our country.
I see that Zyg as a member state representative is rather cautious when it comes to investment. To be frank, investment is probably among the less controversial issues. Both economies are open to foreign direct investment. Both economies ensure a stable and level playing field in most cases for foreign investors. There are, however, some particular aspects of investment which have to be still worked out, and especially the exact way of investment protection. This is one area where still there is work to be done, and but overall I think that investment will be not one of the most difficult issues. These figures which I have cited, that something like 1.2 trillion investment flow, so in that range for both sides by itself, show that there is both huge interest but also huge openness to investment from each other.
No, I would just reiterate what my colleagues are saying. Investment is already extremely open between the U.S. and the EU. I think it shakes out to, it's like 1 million in trade and like 3 million in two-way investment. I mean, a huge part of the relationship is investment. And the US and the EU have already developed and co-signed joint principles for investment. It's in many ways a very easy conversation because there already is so much agreement in that area. So I think part of the conversation in these discussions, the US-EU negotiation, is what more and additional is it actually going to be useful to focus on, and then how that stacks up in comparison with these other topics that we're looking at.
I suppose that the one area I'm aware of where there are still barriers, I think both ways, is aviation. So I don't know whether that is like things are like.
Both, right?
Yeah,
Their ownership.
I think there's investment restrictions there. So if we're, as you say, in many respects it's open, but that's an area perhaps where there could be more openness and therefore more investment.
Are there any other questions other than which way do we go for the glass of wine after the discussion? So thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you all for being here. On behalf of the EU House in Riga, enjoy your evening, and please come to the back of the room for a glass of wine. Thank you.